The gunshot that killed Zachary Winters still echoed in Zelda Jameson's nightmares, though it had been her husband Marcus who pulled the trigger in what the sheriff ruled self-defense. It was 1879 in Pahrump, Nevada, a dusty settlement where the desert stretched endlessly in all directions and secrets died slower than men. Zelda stood at her kitchen window, her fingers trembling against the rough wood of the sill as she watched Marcus ride toward town, his broad shoulders tense with the control he wielded over everything in their lives, including what entered her mouth. She had not realized how tightly he gripped the reins of their household until 3 months into their marriage, when she had reached for a biscuit at supper, and his hand had clamped down on her wrist hard enough to bruise. "You will eat what I give you when I give it to you," he had said, his voice flat and cold as January frost. That had been 8 months ago, and in that time, Zelda had learned that Marcus measured out her portions with the precision of a man counting gold dust, keeping the pantry locked with a key he wore on a chain around his neck even while he slept. She had grown thin, her dresses hanging loose on a frame that had once been healthy and strong, and the hunger had become a constant companion, gnawing at her insides like a desperate animal. The other women in Pahrump noticed, their eyes following her at church with a mixture of pity and fear, but no one spoke against Marcus Jameson. He owned the largest cattle operation within 50 miles, employed half the men in town, and had a reputation for being unforgiving to those who crossed him. Zelda had married him thinking she was securing a future after her father's death left her with nothing but debts. But she had traded one kind of poverty for another, exchanging empty pockets for an empty stomach. The sound of hoofbeats made her turn from the window, and she saw a rider approaching from the direction of the eastern pastures. She recognized him as one of the newer ranch hands, a man who had arrived in Pahrump about 6 weeks prior, looking for work and willing to break horses for fair wages. His name was Jackson Vale, and he was younger than Marcus by at least 15 years, probably no more than 26 to her own 22 years. He had dark hair that curled at his collar and eyes the color of whiskey in lamplight, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who knew his own worth without needing to prove it to anyone. Zelda stepped back from the window quickly, not wanting to be caught watching, but her movement was too late. Jackson had already seen her, and he tipped his hat in her direction before dismounting near the barn. She felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment, though she could not say exactly why. Perhaps it was because she knew how she must look, gaunt and hollow-eyed, or perhaps it was because Jackson Vale looked at her with something in his expression that Marcus had never shown, a gentleness that made her chest ache with longing for kindness. She busied herself with mending one of Marcus's shirts, though her fingers fumbled with the needle as hunger made her hands unsteady. The clock on the mantel ticked forward, marking the hours until Marcus would return and unlock the pantry long enough to prepare her meager supper. He would watch her eat every bite, his eyes tracking the movement of her fork to her mouth, and if she tried to take more than he had allotted, his anger would be swift and terrible. A knock at the door startled her so badly that she pricked her finger with the needle, and a bead of blood welled up on her skin. She pressed it to her apron and went to answer, expecting perhaps a delivery or one of the ranch hands with a message for Marcus. Instead, she found Jackson Vale standing on her porch, his hat in his hands and his expression apologetic. "Afternoon, Mrs. Jameson," he said, his voice low and respectful. "I hope I am not disturbing you. I was wondering if you might have some water I could spare for my horse. The trough by the barn seems to have run dry." Zelda hesitated, glancing over his shoulder toward the road where Marcus had disappeared. "Of course," she said finally, stepping aside. There is a pump just around the side of the house. Help yourself." Jackson nodded his thanks, but he did not move immediately. Instead, his gaze traveled over her face, taking in details she wished he would not notice. "Are you all right, madam?" he asked quietly. "You look a bit pale." "I am fine," she said quickly, too quickly, and she saw the doubt flicker in his eyes. "Just tired is all. The heat has been fierce this week." He studied her for another moment, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see straight through her careful lies to the truth beneath. But he did not press the matter, simply nodded again and went to tend to his horse. Zelda closed the door and leaned against it, her heart hammering in her chest for reasons she could not entirely name. There was danger in kindness, especially from a man who was not her husband, and she knew Marcus would be furious if he learned that Jackson had spoken to her alone. She returned to her mending, but her mind was elsewhere, circling around the brief exchange and the way Jackson's eyes had softened with concern. It had been so long since anyone had looked at her that way, as though she mattered beyond what she could provide or endure. The hunger in her belly seemed to sharpen, and she pressed a hand against it, trying to quiet the growling that had become as familiar as breathing. When Marcus returned that evening, he was in a foul mood, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. Zelda set aside her sewing and stood, smoothing her hands over her apron in a gesture that had become automatic, a way of steadying herself before facing whatever storm he had brought home. He moved through the house like a thundercloud, pouring himself a generous measure of whiskey before finally turning his attention to her. "Fix supper," he ordered, tossing the pantry key onto the table. "And make it quick. I have business to attend to tonight." Zelda took the key with numb fingers and unlocked the pantry, her eyes scanning the shelves that were so tantalizingly full while knowing she could only take what Marcus would approve. She pulled out potatoes, a small piece of salt pork, and some flour for biscuits, working quickly to prepare a meal that would satisfy his appetite while leaving her with barely enough to keep her upright. As she cooked, Marcus sat at the table watching her, and she could feel the weight of his gaze like a physical thing, pressing down on her shoulders. They ate in silence, Marcus consuming his food with the mechanical efficiency of a man who took no pleasure in the act, while Zelda forced down her small portion, each bite a battle against the nausea that came from eating too little for too long. When she reached for a second biscuit, thinking perhaps he would not notice, his hand shot out and caught her wrist in a grip that made her gasp. "Did I say you could have more?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. "No," she whispered, her eyes downcast. "I am sorry." He released her with a sound of disgust and pushed back from the table, leaving his dishes for her to clean. "I will be back late," he said, retrieving his hat. "Do not wait up." The moment he was gone, Zelda sank into her chair, her whole body trembling with exhaustion and suppressed tears. She looked at the biscuit he had denied her, still sitting on the plate, and felt a wave of despair so profound it threatened to pull her under. This was her life now, an endless cycle of deprivation and control, and she could see no way out of it that did not involve scandal or worse. She cleaned the kitchen mechanically, locked the pantry, and left the key on the table where Marcus would find it when he returned. Then she climbed the stairs to their bedroom and lay down fully clothed on top of the quilt, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the desert night filtering through the open window. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote howled, and she thought it sounded like the loneliness that lived in her own chest. The next morning brought Jackson Vale back to the house, this time with a legitimate reason. One of the horses had thrown a shoe, and he needed to use the forge in the barn to repair it. Marcus had already left for the day, riding out to check on the herd in the northern pastures, and Zelda was alone when Jackson knocked on the door to ask permission. She granted it, of course, having no reason to refuse, and then retreated to the kitchen to begin her chores. An hour later, there was another knock, softer this time, and when she answered it, Jackson was standing there with something wrapped in a clean cloth. "I thought you might like this," he said, holding it out to her. "I had extra from breakfast, and it seemed a shame to let it go to waste." Zelda took the bundle automatically, her fingers registering the warmth of whatever was inside before her mind caught up to what was happening. She unfolded the cloth and found 2 thick slices of bread spread with butter and jam, along with a hard-boiled egg. Her mouth watered so intensely it was almost painful, but fear rose up just as quickly, cold and sharp. "I cannot," she said, trying to hand it back to him. "My husband would not approve." Jackson did not take it. Instead, he looked at her with those whiskey-colored eyes, and she saw understanding there, along with something that might have been anger on her behalf. "Your husband is not here," he said gently, "and what he does not know cannot hurt you. You need to eat, Mrs. Jameson. Anyone can see that." She wanted to refuse, wanted to be strong enough to send him away and maintain the careful balance she had learned to walk in her marriage. But the hunger was too great, and the kindness in his offer too tempting to resist. She nodded mutely and stepped back, allowing him to follow her into the kitchen. She sat at the table and unwrapped the food again, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the egg. "Go on," Jackson said, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed. "Eat." Zelda took a bite of the bread, and the flavors exploded across her tongue with such intensity that she nearly moaned aloud. She had forgotten what it felt like to eat without fear, to take food simply because her body needed it. She forced herself to eat slowly, mindful of how her stomach had shrunk, but every bite was a revelation, a small act of rebellion against the control Marcus held over her. Jackson watched her in silence, and when she finished, he took the cloth and tucked it back into his pocket. "I will bring you something tomorrow," he said, as though it were already decided. "Around this time after your husband leaves." "You should not," Zelda said, but the protest was weak even to her own ears. "If he finds out, he will dismiss you or worse." "Then we will make sure he does not find out," Jackson replied, and there was a firmness in his voice that left no room for argument. "No one should go hungry when there is plenty to eat. It is not right, Mrs. Jameson, what he is doing to you." Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, and she blinked them back furiously, not wanting to break down in front of this man who was little more than a stranger. "Why do you care?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jackson was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his words were careful, measured. "Because I have seen men like your husband before, and I know what they are capable of. Because you deserve better than to waste away in your own home. And because," he paused, his gaze holding hers, "I cannot stand by and do nothing when I have the power to help." He left after that, returning to his work, and Zelda sat alone in the kitchen with the ghost of bread and butter still on her tongue. She felt something shifting inside her, a small crack in the walls she had built around her heart, and it terrified her even as it gave her the first glimmer of hope she had felt in months. True to his word, Jackson returned the next morning, and the morning after that, always with food wrapped carefully in cloth, always with that same gentle insistence that she eat. Sometimes it was bread and cheese, other times it was leftover stew or a piece of chicken, and once it was a slice of pie that one of the women in town had made for the ranch hands. Zelda began to live for those moments, for the brief respite from hunger and the even briefer taste of human kindness. They spoke little during these exchanges, both aware of the danger they courted if Marcus were to discover what was happening. But gradually, as the days turned into weeks, Zelda began to feel stronger, her body responding to the regular nourishment with a vitality she had almost forgotten was possible. Color returned to her cheeks, and the trembling in her hands eased, and with the physical recovery came a slow awakening of her spirit. She found herself watching for Jackson's arrival, her heart lifting when she saw him approach the house. They began to talk more, small conversations at first about the weather or the ranch, but gradually deepening into something more personal. He told her about his childhood in Texas, about losing his parents to fever when he was 16 and making his own way in the world ever since. She told him about her father, about how she had loved running the small general store he owned before his heart gave out, and about the suffocating loneliness of her marriage. "Why did you marry him?" Jackson asked one morning, his voice curious rather than judgmental. Zelda looked down at her hands, at the simple gold band on her finger that felt more like a shackle than a symbol of love. "I had no choice," she said quietly. "My father died with debts I could not pay. Marcus offered to settle them in exchange for my hand, and I thought it was the practical thing to do. I thought I could learn to be content, if not happy." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I was wrong." Jackson reached across the table and covered her hand with his own, a gesture so unexpected and warm that it made her breath catch in her throat. "You deserve happiness," he said firmly. "You deserve to be cherished, not controlled. I wish I could do more than bring you food." "This is enough," Zelda said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew they were not entirely true. The food had saved her body, but it was Jackson's presence, his unwavering kindness and the way he looked at her as though she were precious, that was slowly saving something deeper. She was falling in love with him. She realized with a jolt of fear and exhilaration, falling in love with a man who was not her husband, and the knowledge was both thrilling and terrifying. The turning point came on a sweltering afternoon in late August, when Marcus returned home unexpectedly early, and found Zelda in the kitchen with more color in her face than she had shown in months. He studied her with narrowed eyes, suspicion radiating from him like heat from a stove. "You look better," he said, and it was an accusation rather than a compliment. "Have you been getting into the pantry without permission?" "No," Zelda said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I have only eaten what you have given me." Marcus moved closer, his hand reaching out to grip her chin and turn her face toward the light. "You are lying," he said flatly. "You have gained weight. Someone has been feeding you." Terror seized her, but she forced herself to meet his gaze without flinching. "I do not know what you mean." "Perhaps I am simply adjusting to the portions you provide." He released her with a shove that sent her stumbling back against the counter. "If I find out you have been deceiving me, you will regret it," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I will not tolerate disobedience under my own roof." He stormed out, leaving Zelda shaking with fear and anger in equal measure. She knew she had to warn Jackson, had to tell him that Marcus was suspicious, and that they needed to be more careful or perhaps stop altogether. The thought of going back to hunger, of losing those precious moments of connection, made her want to weep, but she could not let Jackson suffer because of her. When he came the next morning, she met him at the door and pulled him quickly inside, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Marcus knows something is wrong. He noticed that I look healthier and he is suspicious. You cannot keep bringing me food. It is too dangerous." Jackson listened, his jaw tightening with anger as she spoke. "So he would rather you starve than accept help from someone else." "That is not a husband, Mrs. Jameson. That is a jailer." "I know," she said, her voice breaking. "But what choice do I have? I have nowhere to go, no money of my own. If I leave him, I will be worse off than I was before." Jackson took her by the shoulders, his touch gentle but urgent. "Look at me," he said, waiting until her eyes met his. You always have a choice. It might not be an easy one, but it exists. I have been saving my wages, and I have enough to get us both to California where we could start fresh. Come with me, Zelda. Leave this place, and this man who treats you like property. Her first name on his lips sent a shiver through her, and she realized it was the first time he had used it. I cannot ask that of you, she whispered. You would be throwing away your whole life for someone you barely know. I know you well enough, Jackson said, his eyes blazing with conviction. I know you are brave and kind and deserving of so much more than this half-life you are living. I know that I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you, and that if I ride away from Pahrump without you, I will regret it for the rest of my days. So please, Zelda, say yes. Say you will come with me. She wanted to say yes with every fiber of her being, wanted to throw caution to the wind and run away with this man who had shown her more care in a few short weeks than her husband had in nearly a year of marriage. But fear held her back, fear of the unknown and of Marcus's wrath if he caught them. Let me think about it, she said finally, and saw disappointment flicker across Jackson's face before he nodded. I will wait, he said, but not forever. Marcus will only get worse, Zelda. Men like him always do. He was right, and she knew it. Over the following days, Marcus's behavior became increasingly erratic and controlling. He began checking the pantry multiple times a day, counting every item to ensure nothing was missing. He started coming home at odd hours, trying to catch her in some imagined betrayal. And he reduced her food portions even further, until she was dizzy with hunger and exhaustion once more. Jackson continued to bring her food when he could, but they had to be more careful now, meeting in the barn or behind the house where Marcus would not see. Each stolen moment felt weighted with urgency, and Zelda could see the frustration building in Jackson's eyes every time he had to watch her suffer. This cannot go on, he said one evening as they stood in the shadow of the barn, the sun setting in a blaze of orange and gold over the desert. He is killing you slowly, and I cannot stand by and watch it happen. Please, Zelda, come away with me, tonight if you are willing. I have everything ready. Zelda looked at him, at the earnest hope in his face, and felt something break open inside her. She thought of all the years stretching ahead if she stayed. Years of hunger and control and loneliness. Years of watching the light slowly die in her own eyes. And then she thought of what life might be like with Jackson, filled with simple kindness and the possibility of real happiness, and she knew what her answer had to be. Yes, she said, the word coming out in a rush of breath and relief. Yes, I will come with you. The joy that lit Jackson's face was almost painful in its intensity. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest, and she felt his heart hammering against her own. We will leave tonight, he said into her hair. Pack only what you can carry and meet me by the old cottonwood tree on the eastern boundary at midnight. Can you do that? I can, she said, pulling back to look up at him. But Jackson, what about your job? The other ranch hands will know you are gone, and Marcus will put together what happened. Let him, Jackson said fiercely. By the time he realizes we have left, we will be halfway to California, and even if he comes after us, I will not let him take you back. You have my word on that. They parted reluctantly, and Zelda returned to the house with her heart pounding and her mind racing. She moved through the evening in a daze, preparing Marcus's supper and serving it without meeting his eyes, all while planning her escape. She packed a small bag with her few precious belongings, a photograph of her parents, some clothing, and the little bit of money she had managed to hide away over the months, and hid it under the bed. Marcus went to sleep around 10, his snores filling the bedroom within minutes. Zelda lay beside him, every muscle tense, waiting for the hours to crawl past. When the clock finally struck 11:30, she slipped carefully from the bed and retrieved her bag, moving with painstaking slowness to avoid making any noise. She was halfway down the stairs when a floorboard creaked beneath her foot and she froze, her breath caught in her throat. "Where are you going?" Marcus's voice came from the darkness above her, cold and alert. Zelda's mind raced, searching for a plausible lie. "I could not sleep. I thought I would make some tea." There was a long pause, and then she heard him moving, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. He appeared beside her, his hand clamping down on her arm like a vise. "With a packed bag?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Do you take me for a fool?" Fear turned her blood to ice, but she forced herself to stand straight, to meet his gaze without cowering. "I am leaving you, Marcus. I cannot live like this anymore." His face contorted with rage, and his grip on her arm tightened until she cried out in pain. "You are my wife," he snarled. "You go nowhere without my permission. And if you think that Cowboy is going to save you, you are sadly mistaken. I will see him dead before I let him take what is mine." The words sent panic shooting through her, and she tried to pull away, but Marcus was too strong. He dragged her down the remaining stairs and toward the front door, and she realized with horror that he intended to confront Jackson. She fought against him, scratching and kicking, desperation lending her strength she did not know she possessed. "Let me go," she screamed, not caring who heard. "I will not let you hurt him." Marcus backhanded her across the face, the blow snapping her head to the side and filling her mouth with the taste of blood. "You will do as you are told," he said, reaching for the rifle that hung above the door. But before he could grasp it, the door burst open and Jackson stood framed in the entrance, his own pistol drawn and his face set in hard lines. "Step away from her," he said, his voice ringing with authority. Marcus spun around, dragging Zelda in front of him like a shield. "This is my wife and my property," he spat. "You have no right to interfere." "She is a human being, not property," Jackson replied, his gun never wavering. "And I am giving you one chance to let her go peacefully. After that, I cannot promise what will happen." For a moment, the three of them stood frozen in a deadly tableau, the air thick with tension and violence. Then Marcus shoved Zelda aside so hard that she fell, and reached for the rifle. Jackson fired, the shot deafening in the small space, and Marcus crumpled to the floor with a cry of pain, blood blooming across his shoulder. "The next one goes through your heart," Jackson said, moving forward to kick the rifle out of reach. "So I suggest you stay down." Zelda scrambled to her feet, her whole body shaking with shock and relief. Jackson reached for her with his free hand, pulling her behind him, his eyes never leaving Marcus, who lay on the floor groaning and cursing. "We need to go," Jackson said urgently. "Now, before someone comes to investigate the shot." They ran into the night, leaving Marcus bleeding on his own floor, and raced toward the eastern boundary where Jackson had 2 horses waiting. He helped her mount, and then swung into his own saddle, and they rode hard into the darkness, the desert stretching out before them like a promise of freedom. They did not stop until dawn, when the horses were lathered with sweat, and they were miles from Pahrump. Jackson found a sheltered spot beneath an outcropping of rock, and they dismounted, both of them trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. Zelda sank to the ground, and Jackson knelt beside her, his hands cupping her face gently. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his eyes searching hers with concern. "No," she said, though her cheek throbbed where Marcus had struck her. "You came for me. You saved me." "I told you I would not let him take you back," Jackson said, his thumb brushing carefully over the bruise forming on her face. "I meant it, Zelda. I will protect you with my life if I have to." She leaned forward and kissed him, a desperate, grateful kiss that spoke of all the emotions churning inside her. He responded immediately, his arms going around her and pulling her close, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Zelda felt safe. They traveled west over the following weeks, moving through small towns and avoiding main roads where word of their flight might have spread. Jackson found work where he could, breaking horses or doing ranch labor, and they lived simply but happily, sharing cheap rooms in boarding houses and meals cooked over open fires. With every mile they put between themselves and Pahrump, Zelda felt lighter, as though she were shedding the weight of her old life like a snake sheds its skin. Jackson courted her properly during that journey, bringing her wildflowers he found growing in improbable places, and telling her stories to pass the long hours of riding. He asked her about her dreams for the future, listened when she spoke about wanting to open another store like her father's, and promised to help her make it happen once they reached California. And gradually, the fear and trauma of her marriage began to fade, replaced by a growing certainty that she had found in Jackson something rare and precious, a love based on mutual respect and genuine care. They arrived in Sacramento in late October, when the air was crisp and the leaves on the trees were turning gold. Jackson used his savings to rent a small house on the edge of town, and they were married by a judge 3 days later, Zelda having secured a quiet divorce from Marcus through a lawyer who asked no uncomfortable questions. She wore a simple blue dress, and Jackson wore his best shirt, and they spoke their vows with their hands clasped tight and their eyes shining with tears of happiness. Life in California was everything Pahrump had not been. Jackson found steady work at a nearby ranch, and Zelda used the remainder of their savings to open a small general store, which quickly became popular with the local families. She loved the work, loved the feeling of independence and purpose it gave her, and loved even more coming home each evening to Jackson, who always greeted her with a kiss and asked about her day as though he genuinely cared about the answer. They fell into an easy rhythm of domestic life, cooking meals together and sitting on their porch in the evenings to watch the sun set. Jackson never tried to control what she ate or how she spent her time, and the freedom of it was intoxicating. She gained weight healthily, her body filling out to the strong, vibrant form it had been before Marcus, and she found joy in simple things like choosing her own meals and eating until she was satisfied. Their physical relationship blossomed slowly, built on a foundation of trust and tenderness that made every touch feel sacred. Jackson was patient and gentle, always attuned to her needs and careful never to take more than she was willing to give. And when they finally came together completely, it was with a sense of rightness that made Zelda weep with gratitude for having found a man who saw her as an equal partner rather than property to be controlled. A year after their arrival in Sacramento, Zelda discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with a complex mixture of joy and fear, memories of her first marriage casting shadows over what should have been an uncomplicated happiness. But Jackson was thrilled, his excitement so pure and genuine that it slowly eased her worries. He doted on her throughout the pregnancy, bringing her breakfast in bed and rubbing her swollen feet in the evenings. And when their son was born on a warm spring day in 1881, Jackson held the baby with tears streaming down his face and whispered that he was the luckiest man alive. They named him James, after Jackson's father, and he was a beautiful, healthy child with his mother's dark hair and his father's whiskey-colored eyes. Zelda marveled at how different this experience was from what she had imagined motherhood would be under Marcus's roof, how Jackson shared every responsibility from diaper changes to midnight feedings without complaint. He was a natural father, patient and playful, and watching him with their son made Zelda fall in love with him all over again. The store continued to thrive, and Jackson was promoted to foreman at the ranch, their combined incomes allowing them to save money and dream of a bigger future. They talked about buying land of their own someday, maybe raising horses or cattle, building something they could pass down to James and whatever other children might come. It was a simple dream, but it was theirs, built on a foundation of mutual love and respect. 2 years later, Zelda gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Josephine. She had her father's smile and her mother's determination, and she ruled the household from the moment she arrived with a will of iron wrapped in laughter. Jackson was just as besotted with her as he had been with James, and Zelda often found him sitting in the rocking chair with Josephine asleep on his chest, his hand spread protectively across her tiny back. Life was not without its challenges. They faced illness and financial setbacks, the ordinary trials that every family encounters. But they faced them together, and that made all the difference. Jackson never raised his voice in anger, never lifted his hand in violence, and never once tried to control Zelda the way Marcus had. Instead, he treated her as his partner in every sense of the word, valuing her opinions and supporting her ambitions. Sometimes, in quiet moments, Zelda thought about Pahrump and the life she had left behind. She had heard through letters from acquaintances that Marcus had recovered from his gunshot wound and had remarried within a year, some young woman from a neighboring town who probably had no idea what she was walking into. Zelda felt sorry for her, but she could not regret her own escape. She had been given a second chance at life, and she had seized it with both hands. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Jackson surprised her with a piece of land just outside Sacramento. 10 acres of rolling hills with a stream running through it and a perfect spot for building a house. "I know you wanted something of our own," he said, his arm around her waist as they stood looking out over their future. "Somewhere we can grow old together and watch our grandchildren play." Zelda turned to face him, her hands coming up to frame his face. "You have given me everything I never knew I needed," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Not just food when I was starving, but love when I had forgotten what it felt like. You saved my life, Jackson Vale, in every way that matters." He kissed her then, slow and sweet, and she tasted in that kiss all the promises they had made and kept, all the challenges they had overcome together. When they pulled apart, James and Josephine came running up the hill toward them, their laughter bright in the afternoon air, and Zelda felt her heart swell with a happiness so complete it almost frightened her. They built their house over the following year, Jackson and some hired hands doing most of the heavy work while Zelda managed the details and kept the store running. It was a beautiful home, larger than their rental but still modest, with big windows that let in light and a wide porch perfect for watching sunsets. They moved in on a warm day in June, carrying their furniture and belongings across the threshold of their own property. And that night, they made love in their new bedroom with the windows open and the scent of jasmine drifting in on the breeze. The ranch Jackson had been working for offered to sell him a small herd of cattle on favorable terms, and he accepted, beginning to build his own operation on their land. Zelda continued running her store, now hiring a young woman to help her so she could spend more time at home with the children. They worked together, side by side, building a life that was rich not in material wealth but in love and purpose, and the deep satisfaction of knowing they had created something good together. More children came. A third son they named Jacob, and then twin girls, Lily and Rose, who arrived unexpectedly and threw the household into joyful chaos. Their house rang with laughter and the sounds of children playing, and Jackson proved to be as patient and loving with each new addition as he had been with the first. He taught the boys to ride and rope, showed them how to treat animals with respect and women with honor, and he made sure all his children, including the girls, learned to read and write and think for themselves. Zelda watched him with their children and sometimes marveled at how close she had come to missing all of this, how easily she might have wasted away in that house in Pahrump. Another sad story of a woman who had no voice and no choice. But Jackson had given her both, had seen her suffering and refused to look away, and in doing so had changed the entire trajectory of her life. She never forgot the gift of those daily meals he had brought her, the quiet rebellion of feeding someone who was being starved. It had been more than just sustenance. It had been a declaration that she mattered, that her suffering was not acceptable, that she deserved to be cared for. And from that simple act of kindness had grown something neither of them could have anticipated, a love story that would sustain them through decades of life together. As the years passed and their children grew, Jackson and Zelda remained as devoted to each other as they had been in those early days. They still sat on their porch in the evenings, now with grandchildren climbing on their laps, and Jackson still looked at Zelda as though she were the most precious thing in his world. She had long since regained her health, her body strong from good food and hard work, but more than that, her spirit had healed. The wounds Marcus had inflicted slowly fading until they were nothing more than scars that reminded her of how far she had come. On their 20th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party, inviting friends and neighbors to celebrate the love that had built such a beautiful family. As Zelda stood in the yard of the home they had built together, surrounded by the laughter of children and grandchildren, she caught Jackson's eye across the crowd. He smiled at her, that same gentle smile that had given her hope in her darkest days, and she felt tears prick at her eyes. Later, when the guests had gone and they were alone in their bedroom, Jackson pulled her into his arms and held her close. "I would do it all again," he murmured into her hair. "Every risk, every hard day, every moment of uncertainty, you were worth it all, Zelda. You will always be worth it." She held him tighter, her face pressed against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I know," she whispered. "And I would choose you again and again in every lifetime. You taught me that love does not have to hurt, that it can be gentle and nourishing and steady. You fed me when I was starving, not just my body but my soul, and I will love you until my last breath for that." They stood there in the quiet of their room, two people who had found each other in the hardest of circumstances and built something beautiful from the ashes of Zelda's first marriage. Outside, the California night was soft and warm, full of promise and peace, and inside they had everything they had ever needed: each other, their family, and a love that had proven strong enough to overcome anything. The store Zelda had opened eventually became a landmark in Sacramento, passed down to their daughter Josephine, who ran it with the same care and attention her mother had shown. The ranch grew into a successful operation, managed by James with help from his brothers, and the land Jackson had bought on their anniversary became a gathering place for the entire family, a testament to what could be built when two people committed to building each other up rather than tearing each other down. Jackson and Zelda lived to see their grandchildren marry and have children of their own, lived to celebrate 50 years of marriage surrounded by a family that numbered in the dozens. They grew old together gracefully, their love deepening with each passing year rather than fading. And when Jackson finally passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, Zelda held his hand and whispered all the words of love and gratitude she had spoken 1,000 times before. She lived another 3 years without him, surrounded by children and grandchildren who made sure she never wanted for anything, who fed her with the same care Jackson had shown all those years ago in Pahrump. And when she finally closed her eyes for the last time, she did so with a smile on her face, knowing that she had lived a full life, had loved deeply and been loved in return, and that somewhere beyond this world, Jackson was waiting for her. Their story became a legend in the family, passed down through generations as an example of what real love looked like. The younger ones heard about the cowboy who had saved their grandmother by bringing her food every day, who had seen her suffering and refused to accept it, who had loved her enough to risk everything to give her a chance at happiness. And they learned from it, learned that love should never involve control or cruelty, that true partnership meant lifting each other up and meeting each other's needs with tenderness and care. The house Jackson and Zelda built still stood decades later, weathered but strong, a monument to two people who had refused to let circumstances define their future. And in the town of Sacramento, in the store that bore the family name, there hung a photograph of a young couple on their wedding day, their faces shining with hope and love, a reminder that even in the hardest times, even when the world seems determined to break you, love can find a way to flourish if you are brave enough to reach for it.